Well, my name is Chris Nelson. I have the honor to chair this final session. We've promised to present you with a complete resolution of the North Korean problem in the next 25 minutes. Obviously, well, we'll see where we get. North Korea's forced nuclear test in January was a flagrant violation of every known UN security resolution and a grave threat to Northeastern security. We all agree on that. But once again, the international community has had difficulty mounting a consistent, unified response that would prevent further nuclear weapons development. So what can we do? That's the official thing. Let me tell you where I'm coming from on this a bit, and then we'll get to the discussion. I arrived as a full-time Asia person on the House Foreign Affairs Committee in March of 1977. I was sitting in the Asia Subcommittee office, my first day at work, first hour. I was feeling pretty good. All by myself, and the phone rang. Asia Subcommittee. Who's this? Chris Nelson. Chris, this is Dick Holbrooke. You've got to help me undo the stupid decision President Carter made, pulling troops out of South Korea. Yes, sir. You know, I'm 32 years old. It's my first day in the office, and I have the Assistant Secretary of State telling me that the President's made a terrible decision on moving troops to South Korea. I'm still sort of sitting there twitching from that one, although we now know, of course, that was classic Dick Holbrooke, bless his soul. So 20 minutes later, half an hour later, knock on the door, and come in. And it was a guy that maybe some of you old timers remember, Ferris Harvey, was a longtime human rights, civil rights activist on South Korea. And his message was, South Korea is a terrible military dictatorship. The United States has no business supporting these guys. Pull the troops out, cut the military aid. So within the first hour on the job, I've got Dick Holbrooke telling me the president is crazy, and I've got Ferris Harvey telling me everything we're doing is wrong. Well, fast forward 15 years or so, I'm out wandering around the Rayburn building looking for things for my report, for the Nelson report. And I run into my old colleague from the Foreign Affairs Committee, Stan Roth, who in 1994 was the Assistant Secretary of State for Asia. Hey, Stan, what's up? How are you going to sell this agreed framework to Congress? They're never going to send money to North Korea. Come on, get real. And Stanley said, and believed it because that was the brief, these guys will be gone in 2 years. They're going to collapse. There's no way we're going to have to worry about funding the North Korean government, for the next 15 or 20 years. 2 years tops. That's what we all believed then. Well, here we are. It's 20 years later. We're trapped in an endless Groundhog Day movie, trying to find a workable political and strategic formula which could denuclearize North Korea without causing a catastrophe for the Korean people. The problem is that movie, those of you may have seen it, the movie's theme was if you keep improving yourself and get better, you will get the girl. Well, on North Korea, what's the girl? Denuclearization? Never going to happen with the Kim regime in power. That's what we all think now. A freeze on continued development and eventual success on a working ICBM? Suggest how to do that without accepting Pyongyang as a nuclear power. That's a non-starter for the U.S. government, for Japan, President Park, and likely also our Chinese and Russian friends. Regime change? Well, it means vastly different things to each player. For the ROK, it means unification, but to the DPRK, it means a military takeover of South Korea. So when President Park says unification, Kim Jong-un apparently hears hostility, attack, build more bombs. So for the US and Japan, regime change means finding a way to depose the Kim regime without risking the death of the Korean people. Apparently for now, through enhanced and relentless sanctions requiring China's faithful implementation, as we've heard Song Kim reiterate when he was here last week, and then at both the White House and State Department briefings yesterday, saying that we're going to push sanctions and everybody's going to participate. And that brings us to Chun, of course. As we've heard all week at the plenum, China's made it very clear it will not accept the forced collapse of the Kim regime, since it cannot tolerate the risk of instability right next door. Well, that's been the situation for the last 25 years. So does the only regime change scenario acceptable to the 5 parties, Seoul, Beijing, Tokyo, Washington, and Moscow, does that mean somehow stimulating an Eastern European-style economic and social reform program that changes the regime, as Colin Powell famously suggested once to Saddam Hussein? That is, by finding inducements to change the DPRK's behavior. China seems to be thinking like this, and I hope we'll explore that. But my question is, do we have time for that, assuming it's even possible? The last 2 U.S. Secretaries of Defense have said that a working North Korean ICBM would be a strategic game changer for the U.S. Really? If true, and not just rhetoric, what does that mean for the people of South Korea? According to the latest ROK intelligence, isn't the assessment now that Kim Jong-un has a successful ICBM capability, if not close, if he's not there already? And if a U.S. president really thinks that Los Angeles or Washington, D.C. is seriously at risk, what does that mean? So it sounds like we're chasing our tails here. Groundhog Day again and again, unless we are willing to risk war and the destruction of everything the people of South Korea built for the past 60 years, which clearly we are not. So what's your suggestion? Now, that's what I hope we're going to talk about. Now, we have a just terrific panel for this. Ambassador Bessho from our friends and allies in Japan is well known to you, and you've got the bios. Ambassador Chun, who's been doing this for years and years and knows more about it than most of us. Gary, you haven't been an ambassador yet, but there's still time, right? Gary Samore did all this for the National Security Council and knows a great deal about the non-proliferation aspects of it. And my dear friend Xiyu from China, it's great to see you again. And I think we've had this discussion before. So I'm hoping that that we can deal with the questions that I've raised in my opening remark. But I do want to home in on one thing that came up especially clearly today from Bob Einhorn, whom I don't think is here. I think he had to go meet in the National Assembly. So I'm going to take the liberty of paraphrasing Einhorn. Because I think he's asked the key question from my list of questions. Is it conceivable that we can get going on a freeze negotiation with North Korea, given the apparent North Korean precondition that we accept them as a nuclear power? Putting it another way, under what circumstances can we get to a freeze discussion with the North Koreans that would be politically acceptable in Washington, in Tokyo, in Seoul, in Beijing, in Moscow? So let's begin with that one. And one of the great things about having ambassadors is they can give you the diplomatic thinking, but also the government policy. So if we don't mind, let's take a look at, for a few minutes, is it possible to have a politically acceptable negotiation with North Korea on freeze? And how would we get there?
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Nelson. I was thinking what I should be saying in this panel, and suddenly it dawned upon me that the 4 panelists, we have all worked on North Korea for some years in our respective governments. And so if Asan Institute puts us on a panel together and ask same old North Korea, it basically means, no, you guys have not been successful in changing North Korea. Is it going to be the same old story again? Or is there going to be a new bright idea that will change North Korea? Well, I don't know whether I can really give you a clear-cut answer, especially to the one that you asked, and I'll try to answer that perhaps later on. But why haven't we been successful so far? I think is something that we should ask ourselves first. And in the first panel that we had yesterday, former Foreign Minister Han Sung-ju of Korea said that, well, given the increased magnitude of the problem, now the United States and China are getting to be very serious about the problem, but until recently, the priority was not there. Now, differing views followed after that, so I don't know what is the right answer to that one, But one thing that we need to think about is the other side, that is the North Koreans. If we think that North Koreans have always had a consistent objective and a game plan, knew their interests well and played their hands shrewdly every time without any mistake, well, I think it is a mistake. I think it's a mistake to think that. So, and in a way, it would have been easier for us if they were like that. I think we all suffered because, in a way, they had made mistakes, they had made miscalculations, and we had to deal with that. When Gary Seymour and myself were dealing with this phrase, the agreed framework that you were referring to, and the Kiddo in the 90s, the North Koreans were saying, look, denuclearization is the last dying words of Kim Il-sung. They may have been trying to deceive us about the intentions from them, but I don't know whether they would be using the name Kim Il-sung that lightly, just to deceive simple people like us. So I think at the time, what we agreed on, which seemed like a good idea, I think was not a mistake. That is to offer them a light water reactor in exchange for them to stop going ahead with nuclear development. When Mr. Yang Xiyu was doing a great job crafting together a joint statement of 919 in the six-party talks, we had heard North Koreans say, well, what they want is some level of assurance on their national security. Well, I think the September 90s joint statement gave them that, and it was a balanced statement. I think it was a good achievement, but the North Koreans didn't follow through. Well, were they just giving us a big lie from the start, trying to deceive us and then gain time? Or did something go very wrong? Well, we don't know. We don't know at this day. But one good thing is that now we know where we stand. Now we know where they stand. They've had 4 nuclear tests. Reportedly, their missiles can reach the United States mainland. They claim to be the nuclear weapon state in their constitution, and they demand that the international community accept them, recognize them as such. So it's very clear what their position is now, what their intention is now. So it is, I think, in a way, easier now for the international community to get together and respond in an appropriate manner. And the members of the six-party talks, except for North Korea, are on the same page as far as to say we cannot allow North Korea to be a nuclear weapon state. So the question is how we do it. In the panel yesterday, there was in the question and answer period, there was one panelist who said, well, sanctions don't work, so let's go back to negotiations as soon as possible. And there was one person from the floor, and that's namely you, Mr. Nelson, who said, why this faith in negotiations? I think, am I right? Yes, something like that. And, well, to answer the question, why negotiate, the simple answer is because we have no other choice. There is no judicial or pseudo-judicial mechanism to deal with this issue. Nobody is seeking a military solution, and I don't think it's possible right now. So, negotiations. Having said that, trying to get, sitting around the table, looking at each other, does not start negotiations. You need a scenario, you need at least a vision of where you want to go with that negotiation. And otherwise, we would not have any effect. So, in fact, what we have to do is to have a joint recognition that we are sitting at the table with the view, with the aim of getting North Korea to forget, to forfeit, to drop their nuclear weapons program. Well, you can't expect the North Koreans to agree to that readily, so you need sanctions. And this is where sanctions are important. You need them to come to the table, and you need sanctions to make them come to the table. Well, are sanctions enough to make them come to the table. I think Security Council Resolution 2270 is very different, qualitatively different from the resolution that we have in the past about North Korea. Former previous resolutions basically said the international community will not offer North Korea with technology, components, or financing that North Korea will then use for nuclear development or missile technology development. So in a way, to be short, it was a sort of defensive measure. But 2270 goes beyond that. It has an element of being sanctioned and trying to push North Korea. The Chinese government has often said that North Korea needs to feel the pain. So I think the international community have tried to change their perspective, have tried to change the way in which it operates. However, North Koreans may not react that quickly, and people might start saying, well, the time is not on our side. Well, I think it will take time for sanctions to take a bite, to make it feel, and I think it's important that the rest of the six party talks of the international community should not be too hasty in sitting at the table if we do not have the right common vision of how we want to go from there. North Korea may have changed, but so has, I hope, the international community. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, you raised the key question, and as Bob Einhorn did earlier today, and as we've all said many times during the conference, is China truly prepared to rigorously enforce not just the UN sanctions, but other strictures on North Korea? And perhaps this is the time to ask that question right now. Xiyu Yang, from what you're seeing and hearing from your government, are we there yet? Or are we still in this ambiguous period of not really knowing how far China is prepared to go?
Well, first of all, I don't think Chinese measures, sanctions or attitudes toward North Korea is ambiguous. It's really clear. And regarding to the sanctions, I would say currently all sanction measures on North Korea can be summarized by two types. One type is multilateral under UNSC. The 2270 resolution is not the first time. Actually, is one of the serious measures, the latest one. For example, in 2013, after UNSC resolution, Chinese government issued an executive order to ban a long list of items, about more than 900 items, from exporting to North Korea. Such executive order contributed to constant decreasing of export from China to North Korea in the scale of double digits every year from 2013 to 2015. And after the 2070s, the latest resolution, recently ago, our Ministry of Commerce with the other governmental agencies issued a new executive order to ban mineral products, coal and gold, from importing to North Korea. Some people, observers, may argue, look, in such an executive order, there are some exceptions. Yes, but if you look at the wordings in the documents, the exceptions are very clearly and very concrete. The concrete wording means every importer in China have to provide concrete documents to prove the exporter's purpose for the goods were really designed to the humanitarian purposes inside North Korea. You need to provide a full set of documents and with evidences to show the legitimacy of your deal. And such complicated procedures technically will sharply increase the comprehensive cost for businessmen. And strategically, it's hard for businessmen in China to have ambiguous documents submit to the government, because that is the regulation, is sort of a law in China. So basically, the so-called exceptions, the threshold for the exception is really high, too high to implement easily. So basically, under the new resolution, most of the Chinese businessmen prefer avoiding from escaping from such a business rather than to go through so much more complicated procedures to do business with.
So in essence, you're arguing that from what you're seeing and hearing so far, the Chinese government is prepared to seriously exert pain either directly or indirectly, which brings us to Gary and to Ambassador Chun. Are you hearing here the beginnings of a unified strategy that actually, from your experience, can bear results? Or are we still pushing at the edges and not really getting to the heart of it? Maybe Ambassador Chun and Gary weigh in on this point.
Well, I'm delighted to be part of this panel. And, in terms of the central theme of this conference, new normal in North Korea is totally unacceptable.
Yeah.
And it's totally abnormal to us. With respect to your question, I'm not privy to internal discussions within the Korean government. I'm no longer in government, so I cannot tell you what's going on in the planning from the Korean government. But returning to the issues that Xiyu and Ambassador Bessho referred to, I think it takes change in strategic calculus if we are going to have any chance of denuclearizing North Korea. And I don't doubt China's commitment, a stronger commitment than ever to denuclearize North Korea. And China has taken tougher measures. No one doubts that determination. But I don't see any sign of fundamental change in China's policy toward North Korea, namely putting stability of the North Korean regime before denuclearization. I'm not saying this is wrong, but the message that Kim Jong-un will get from China's position is that don't worry about serious consequences. We will pretend to take sanctions, but not unbearable sanctions for you. So this will be taken by Kim Jong-un as an assurance that he doesn't have to, China is not willing to take any steps that could change his strategic calculus. So under that circumstance, I think all North Korea will do is just to move ahead, even speed up the process of nuclear armament. And before harsher sanctions come into place, I think Kim Jong-un may feel compelled to speed up the process of nuclear and missile development. So until he can bear, as long as he can bear the sanctions, he will not stop until he succeeds in downsizing the warhead to the point of mounting on the means of delivery, namely missiles, short-range or long-range missiles. So until then, I don't think he will be interested in any dialogue, in any negotiations. But if he cannot bear the sanctions anymore, then I think he will take a tactical retreat. And turn to a charm offensive. But when it comes back to the six-party talks or bilateral U.S.-North Korea talks, it's not for denuclearization. I think he will try to play games with the terms of the return, terms of the resumption of the talks. I think he will just to settle with the freeze, keeping of North Korean nuclear capabilities in return for all he has been claiming since September 2005, peace agreement, normalization of relations, what he can characterize as abandonment of U.S. hostile policy and economic package that can change North Korea's fate.
Right.
So that's, I think, what the game plan Kim Jong-un may have now. But you mentioned freeze in your introduction.
Yeah, it's my opening question, really.
Yeah.
If we agree in advance that denuclearization remains out there somewhere years from now, if ever, under the Kim regime, then what are we left with if it is unacceptable to us that the North Koreans develop a successful ICBM, a successfully weaponized warhead for long-range missiles? Isn't that an immediate bottom line that we have declared to be unacceptable? And what does that mean? What does that word mean?
Well, any further movement toward deliverable nuclear arsenal is unacceptable as a matter of principle. But I think when you talk about freeze, it means different things to North Korea and us. Well, for North Korea, if they come back with an idea of a freeze, with a proposal for freeze, that would be, in their view, the end result, the end of the whole denuclearization process. But for us, whether North Korea has 5 nuclear weapons, 10 nuclear weapons, then doesn't make a fundamental difference. For the U.S., maybe it's different. But I think a freeze in the context of full denuclearization is one thing. A freeze just as an end in itself, that's a totally different thing. If we are going to settle with a freeze in itself, then it would end up legitimizing North Korea's nuclear armament. And I don't know whether we would be better off by legitimizing North Korean nuclear arsenal just to get the freeze.
Oh, that was the embedded heart of my question. So let's ask Dr. Samore, who wrestled with, it's almost a theological dispute, isn't it? What are the non-proliferation implications of dealing with North Korea officially as a nuclear power? I know you agonized over that for years on the NSC, and yet here we are now, stuck in this, it's not just definitional.
So Chris, you've done a good job of describing all the structural reasons why we failed over 30 years to stop North Korea's nuclear and missile program. Inducements and pressure haven't worked. We haven't been able to bring about regime change. All the military options are very unrealistic. Whether we're still stuck in that same trap depends upon whether there's a new factor. And the only new factor on the scene that may make a difference is new leadership in North Korea. And I think Kim Jong-un has done a great job of antagonizing the Chinese, of bringing the US and the ROK and Japan closer together on defense cooperation, especially missile defense, on making the United States angry and determined to do something about North Korea's nuclear missile program. The question is whether we can take advantage of this opportunity that Kim Jong-un has created for us. And hopefully he will continue to act in a reckless and provocative way in order to strengthen our bargaining position.
It sounds like be careful what you wish for, but keep going.
So I think he will conduct another nuclear test. I hope he does. And I think we should take advantage of that to increase the sanctions, both multilateral and unilateral, that have already been in place. I think the Chinese support for UN Security Council Resolution 2270 was a significant shift in China's position. Now, we still have to, of course, go through the job of full implementation, and that's going to be difficult. It's going to take time. It will require transparency and coordination between the US and its allies and China and the EU and the ASEAN countries. Sanctions campaigns take a lot of work. They take a long time to work. That's one thing I really learned from the whole Iran experience. It took an international campaign, all different parts of the US government, several years before the sanctions produced an opening for diplomacy, before the government in Iran was prepared to start serious nuclear negotiations on terms that were acceptable to the US. So our first priority has to be putting in place the sanctions regime, making it as effective as possible. In the meantime, while we're doing all that and the diplomatic work that's required, we need to start thinking about what our diplomatic strategy will be with North Korea if and when the sanctions produce a North Korean agreement to resume talks on acceptable terms, which by that I mean terms that don't accept North Korea as a nuclear weapons state, but which are about, denuclearization. And any, diplomatic strategy will require agreement on tactics, on timing, on conditions, on objectives, on what the trade space is, what we're prepared to offer in exchange for North Korean actions. It will require agreement on configuration, 6-party, 4-party, 2-party, all of these different, possibilities. For me, if we could achieve a freeze on fissile material production as part of a comprehensive agreement, as Ambassador Chun mentioned, I think that's an important objective because it will limit the size of North Korea's nuclear program, plus the test moratorium on both nuclear testing and ballistic missile testing will limit their capacity to deliver nuclear weapons. If we could achieve that, I think that would be an important goal. And we'll need to think about what we're prepared to offer in exchange in terms of partial sanctions relief and assistance, because we're not likely to get it for free. Now, will that solve the North Korean problem? Can we depend on the North Koreans to take additional steps toward nuclear disarmament? I don't know that. In the past, they haven't been willing to. I mean, the 1994 agreed framework that I helped to negotiate started with a freeze and then had additional steps North Korea were required to take in order to give up their residual nuclear weapons capability. And they reneged and cheated on the agreement, so it never was completed. That could happen again. Maybe the next diplomatic deal just buys a couple of years. Or maybe we can construct a strong enough coalition so that this time the North Koreans can't wiggle out of the agreement. And I just don't know the answer to that. I think it does depend a great deal on Kim Jong-un and his future. That's why I think, since we can't be confident that diplomacy will work, at the same time that we're doing sanctions and preparing for diplomacy, the absolute fallback is strong military defense and deterrence. And I think it's absolutely essential that as we conduct a diplomatic strategy, we continue to strengthen missile defense as well as our conventional deterrent. Up to now, for all of Kim Jong-un's reckless behavior, his testing and so forth, he's avoided any conventional provocations against South Korea. And I think that's probably because of deterrence. I think that's probably because he recognizes the South Korean government would retaliate and that China and other countries would not support North Korea if it picks a fight with the ROK. So the way to make diplomacy work is to deter and defend at the same time that we build up economic and political pressure.
But let me ask a tactical question, because that reminds me. Back in the horrible aftermath of the Cheonan sinking,
Right.
and then the Waipi Island shelling, my recollection of China's reaction to the dispatch of 7th Fleet elements through the LOC was to take that very personally. And China's reaction became, why are you doing this to us? And I seem to recall the Obama administration making very clear, this is not about you, this is about the North Koreans. We're trying to show, has China's thinking evolved since then? That this is about North Korea? Or are we still stuck in a Chinese mindset that will resist coherent United States, South Korean, and God forbid us, possible Japanese action in the event of a North Korean provocation.
So-
I'm still not clear yet if China really
Well-
quite gets that.
Look, I mean, China has different strategic interests than the US and than the ROK. But Kim Jong-un has created a convergence of tactical interests. I mean, more than I can ever remember, the Chinese government seems to accept that without economic and political pressure against Pyongyang, we're not going to produce any kind of a diplomatic breakthrough. That's an important shift. Now, Kim Jong-un may take actions that shift the Chinese back in the direction of a more neutral position. But for now, we should take advantage of the opportunity that Kim Jong-un has created. And I mean, you know, Ambassador Yang can answer for China, but I think that the Chinese anger and frustration with Kim Jong-un is very, very deep.
For a long time in Cold War era, many people, many Chinese regard North Korea as a strategic buffer zone. What does it mean by the zone for China? That means the buffer zone should provide a stable, peaceful, external environment in that direction of our neighboring area. If North Korea contribute to the stable environment, yes, it's a buffer zone. But if North Korea do something like Yanping shelling incident, or stir up the rhetorical war threats, that's a different thing. That's why in 2013, President Xi Jinping made a very sharp remarks by saying China strongly opposes any country who start from their own selfish purpose to destabilize our neighboring area. When North Korea fed up the crisis in early 2013, when they say the question of war is not whether or not, it's a question of when. So Xi Jinping made such remarks, although didn't name North Korea. So basically, China's policy towards North Korea as well as to South Korea is a Deng Xiaoping doctrine, black cat or white cat, doesn't matter. You know, any country who can contribute to the stability and peace, great. To China, China will cooperate. Any country, no matter it's a socialist or capitalist, if the country destabilizes the region, China will certainly strongly oppose. So that is the doctrine China follow. So returning to North Korea, China's angry to North Korea. Yes, our upset on North Korea are really increasing because of several provocative cases, especially from the constant and more efforts towards the nuclearization. Everyone knows now the bilateral relation between Pyongyang and Beijing has been at the lowest level, simply because by single reason, say the nuclearization. I believe if Pyongyang, I think 2070 resolution make a shock not only to many observers in your country, my country, but also I believe make a shock in Pyongyang. But such a big change from Beijing was really triggered by the so-called hydrogen test plus launch. And if they go further, I believe they will receive the further shocks. That's the Chinese attitude. Say, we set up our position based on our national interests that reflected by peace and stability. No, whoever provokes such a peace and stability, that will receive consequences from Beijing. And number two, denuclearization. North Korea, if go denuclearization, then they will receive positive responses from Beijing and vice versa.
Well, let's home in on sanctions for a minute, because that seems to be something that we're all agreeing on, that, that we've got to get organized, we've got to be strict, we've got to do more, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, you hear commentators, not just critics, saying there's still enormous room for sanctions in North Korea that we have not yet implemented, that there's nowhere near the sanctions in North Korea that we had and still have in place on Iran, for example. Does China share that view? Ambassador Bessho, from Japan's experience, what sorts of sanctions are you looking at now, is your government looking at now, do you think we should be looking at now to start moving on and not just be stuck in this sort of always reacting to the latest North Korean provocation? Because I think that's what worries me about what we've been hearing for the last month or so. We're sort of waiting on the next big missile test or the fifth explosion, and then, my God, we're going to really get serious. Well, don't we have enough now to really get serious? What should we be doing? What new sanctions should we be doing that we haven't done yet and are not in the UN 2270 yet?
Well, I must start. Well, no, you brought up a very important question. Why did it work in Iran? And why doesn't it seem to be working in North Korea? Well, I think one simple answer to that is that, as some people were saying yesterday as well, our sanctions to Iran was much stronger than our sanctions to North Korea, despite the fact that, Iran had not conducted any nuclear tests, whereas North Korea had. So we really have to decide what is really the difference. Now, there are several differences. A lot of people say, well, Iranian government had to look at their people. If they don't like it, they had to change, whereas North Koreans don't care a damn about their people. And of course, Iran had lots of dealings with every country around the world, so they could find loopholes here and there. Whereas in case of North Korea, as long as they had a friendly neighbor, they could somehow survive. The other thing is, of course, in case of Iran, we had lots of unilateral sanctions, some of which, of course, most of which were coming very strongly from the United States, some from Europe. We haven't come to that stage in a big way with North Korea yet. The Europeans are still contemplating what to do. The United States, Japan, and Korea have introduced our own unilateral sanctions, but we have to coordinate this a little bit more. So there is that. The other point that we need to improve on is the fact that some of the countries that we rely on to put sanctions on don't have the capacity to actually implement sanctions. So we are trying to help, for example, Southeast Asian countries build up a export or import control system which helps deal with the sanctions. So there's a lot that we can do even with just 20 to 70 in place. In case of Japan, I think we've really done a lot already, and there's no trade between Japan and Korea, North Korea, for example. So we have to think hard about what to do next. Of course, we can put more people on the list, more entities on the list, but that is something that we have to think about. But if you just look at in terms of Security Council resolutions, yes, there's a lot that we can do.
If Kim Jong-un decides to be clever and call Prime Minister Abe in a week or two or a month or two and say, it's time we really resolve the abductees problem, and they try to get going on that. Has that ship left the harbor or the train left the station? Is it too late for North Korea to try to play that card, in a sense, to break Japan away from this solid front?
Well, I think it's never late. I mean, it's never early. It doesn't work, is the question, the answer.
Yeah, that's my question.
Because when Prime Minister Koizumi visited Pyongyang in 2002, he signed an agreement with Kim Jong-il. They've broken almost all of the things that they said they would do, but we hold on to that paper because they said they admitted to abduction. They said sorry about that. They said a few other things which we hold them to. It's your father, Mr. Kim Jong-un, that signed on to this. So it's an important paper. And in that paper, we agreed that in order to have normalization between Japan and North Korea, we need to resolve the nuclear issue, the missile issue, and the abduction issue in a holistic manner. So that, of course, causes complexities, because if you make advancement in something else, one of these sectors, well, the North Koreans will think hard about how much to put on the table, because they would know that there would not be a total completed settlement with Japan, because the other things are not being settled. But I think we thought that this is a good way to proceed, because as you said, we don't want to be divided with our colleagues, with our partners and allies about how we deal with North Korea. We want to be able to continue to work together very closely, first in the trilateral context of Japan, Korea, and United States, but also with friends like China in dealing with North Korea.
Yeah. Ambassador Chun, did you have?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me go back to the issue of sanctions that you
Yeah.
mentioned, how we can improve on that. We must not forget that sanctions on North Korea, even unilateral sanctions by US Congress, the North Korea Sanctions Act, they target only activities, items, entities related to North Korea's nuclear armament or missile program, basically military programs. So this is a partial sanction, while sanctions against Iran are comprehensive. They cover all those big cash earners which don't have anything to do with Iran's nuclear program. For instance, oil, gas, construction, finance, shipping. I see very little connection between these activities of Iran with Iran's nuclear program. But all these cash earners are captured in US Sanctions Act against Iran. So if you compare the sanctions between North Korea and Iran, I think we can only looking for a miracle for North Korea to change its strategic calculus, because we must admit that rolling back North Korea's nuclear programs should be far more difficult than rolling back Iran's nuclear program, because North Korean nuclear armament is far more advanced than Iran. So under the current sanctions regime, I see little hope of making real progress in denuclearization, despite all the fuss about sanctions. What we can do, I think we have to expand the sanctions to all North Korean state-owned enterprises, not just those items and enterprises dealing with or connected with WMD programs, but all major cash earners for North Korea, not only coal and minerals, but even in the Security Council resolution, there is a serious flaw. It gives such a wide discretion to China in banning North Korean mineral imports, because it only targets those imports that are related to WMD programs. China can claim that all those imports, even if they increase the imports, these have nothing to do. They haven't found any evidence of being related to North Korea's weapons program. So I will really believe Chinese commitment to denuclearization when I see the actual figures of reduction in Chinese imports from North Korea, not the length of the items subject to sanctions. That doesn't matter as much as the actual pain that China can cause on North Korea, to the point of changing North Korea's strategic calculus. Another thing is, I think, another important cards that U.S. still holds is the secondary boycott and sanctions on North Korean financial activities. I think with Iran, U.S. was determined enough to cut Iran off from the international financial system. So Iran could not send money or receive money through international banking system by being shutting out of the SWIFT system. North Korea still enjoys access to SWIFT, international financial transaction system. And there are many ways they can go around sanctions. So I think this should be, U.S. Treasury may have to designate North Korea of a primary money laundering concern and take measures to shut North Korea out of the international banking system. And I think a secondary boycott to any Chinese entities or any other entities doing business with North Korean state-owned enterprises, because whatever these entities do, the cash, whichever North Korean entity earns foreign currency, Kim Jong-un is free to use the money for any purpose that he finds appropriate or he believes is most important for himself or for North Korea.
Right.
So whether that money, the proceeds from coal exports or anything, go into Kim Jong-un's left pocket or right pocket, doesn't matter. If he runs out of money from left pocket, he can use money from right pocket. So I think the availability, the amount of cash flow available to Kim Jong-un, that's the central element in changing Kim Jong-un's strategic calculus.
Gary,
I think there are many other cards to use, untapped cards, but I'm afraid that U.S. is still reluctant to confront China over these
that increasingly becomes a question, doesn't it? But Gary, you've been very patient, and we
So-
wanted to make a point.
So I agree with Ambassador Chun that the economic sanctions against North Korea won't be effective unless they're targeted against the broader economy, not just targeted against the nuclear and missile program. That's why I think UN Security Council Resolution 2270 is so important, because for the first time, it's a step toward broader economic sanctions. Now, as Ambassador Chun says, it still has some loopholes in it, and if there's another nuclear test, we should try to close those loopholes, and hopefully China will agree. I think the U.S. preference in terms of secondary boycott, we of course have, and there will be executive orders that can be used for secondary sanctions against third countries that engage in activities with North Korea. I think the U.S. preference is to try to work with China based on the common interest we have in putting pressure on North Korea. But in the case of Iran, it's a good example. The U.S. did work with China, and for the most part, China cooperated, even though it didn't accept, the legitimacy of U.S. unilateral sanctions. Nonetheless, Chinese companies did, by and large, observe them. But there were a few cases where the U.S. sanctioned a Chinese bank for activities that were contrary. And in the future, if there isn't cooperation, if the U.S. and China can't work together, then we may see a similar action. We may see a similar U.S. sanction against one or two Chinese businesses or financial entities. But that's down the road. I think the putting in place the sanctions regime, 2270, and whatever additional sanctions, this is going to take months, could easily take years. And therefore, it's not likely to come to any critical moment during Obama's presidency. It's really going to be the next president that will be responsible for executing the sanctions and, if the opportunity presents itself, engaging in diplomacy.
But that gets us back to one of the first points I made in my little reminiscence at the start. And that is, we're talking about ages and ages from now when things will really start to bite. But from what we're seeing, Kim Jong-un is certainly not pulling back on his efforts to perfect a miniaturized warhead, to perfect an ICBM. We find it amusing. He flubs his so-called submarines, but he's going to keep at it. We're talking about months, maybe years, before it really hits home. Why is that acceptable to us if what we say is true, that the weapons are so dangerous? Not necessarily that Kim Jong-un is going to wake up tomorrow and decide to commit national suicide, but if he gets a workable ICBM, his intimidation possibilities, his blackmail possibilities become pretty damn serious. So are we really prepared to wait out a process that might produce something down the road?
So I would say two things. First of all, Kim Jong-un would like us to believe that he's much closer to an operational ICBM than I think he is. Until he demonstrates the ability to test an ICBM and to deliver a reentry vehicle successfully, I don't think he has a credible capability. I think he probably has the ability to deliver nuclear weapons by short-range missiles, no-dong missiles, because they've tested those many times, including with reentry vehicles. But he's never successfully launched an intermediate range or long-range missile, with a reentry vehicle. Even the satellite launches don't actually test the reentry capability. So I personally think he's still years away from directly threatening the United States. And in the meantime, the U.S., of course, is working on its missile defense system. So even if North Korea had an operational ICBM, it's not clear that it could get through U.S. missile defenses. I wouldn't want to have to depend upon that for the sake of Los Angeles, but it is another factor.
Well, as a Cal Berkeley man, you could have LA, but
But the final point, Chris, is what's the alternative?
Yeah.
Right? Yes, technically we can destroy through military means
Yes.
North Korea's missile and nuclear capacity.
That's right.
But I don't think any president's prepared to take the
Well,
risk that would trigger a broader conflict.
I think we all agree on that, but that was going to be my next. Let's discuss that for a minute, though, and perhaps deal with it or at least dispense with that. You remember several years ago, Bill Perry, an otherwise enormously sensible guy, advocated a preemptive attack on Yungwoo. Remember that? And we all went, "My God, Bill, how many South Koreans are you willing to kill to protect the United States?" And before he became Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter advocated similarly. Are we all agreed that that the worst case development of a successful ICBM by the North Koreans, there just is no credible U.S. military kinetic response to that, including a preemptive one? That we have to be entirely, I'm sorry, it sounds like I'm condemning the notion, and I'm not, that our only real reaction is THAAD or missile defense? Is that what we're saying? Or are we really still not quite clear in our own mind that there is a potential necessity of a military option if it looks like this guy is really going to get stuff that works?
I don't think we have a credible military option to preemptively attack North Korea's nuclear and missile facilities to prevent them from, acquiring a long-range missile. Because the risk of war is too great, and I don't think U.S. allies are prepared to accept that risk.
Do our ambassadors agree with that?
Well, no, maybe the discussion that you're having between Gary and Chris, it's about U.S. security, isn't it? That's fine. That's fine. Okay. I mean, for you to discuss that, but of course, for those of us, living very close to North Korea, ROK in Japan, I mean,
proximity matters.
That's right.
Proximity matters. It's a different. Well, ICM doesn't matter for us in a way. Yeah. Put it that way, but it's there. The conventional weapons are just as important as nuclear weapons. Right. So we need to try to get North Korea to change its overall diplomatic policy, but in the meantime, I think Gary said something very important, and it's really deterrence that's important. Or was it you, sorry, Mr. Ambassador Chun? And the alliance is very important. We really need to strengthen it. And hopefully we can, the three countries, Japan, Korea, and Japan, Korea, and the United States, can really get our act together so that at least North Koreans feel that it will be foolhardy for them to really be aggressive towards the southern part of the peninsula or to Japan.
Well, U.S. can enjoy the luxury of, the distance between North Korea across the Pacific. We cannot enjoy that kind of luxury. And one fundamental difference that North Korean nuclear armament makes for our national security policy is that it leaves no margin of error when North Korea deploys a deliverable nuclear warhead. Then we cannot allow a single North Korean nuclear device to explode on our territory.
That's right.
So Gary mentioned the need for deterrence and defense. The concern for us is that deterrence, conventional deterrence with North Korea is very likely to fail when North Korea is, or Kim Jong-un is pushed to the edge of an existential crisis. For him, it doesn't make a real difference whether, whether he's attacked by U.S. nuclear weapons or not. When a moment will come for him that such difference doesn't make any sense to him. So all the theory of nuclear deterrence that is applicable to all other normal nuclear weapon states may not be applicable to North Korea, because North Korea is the only state which is likely to expire at a certain point down the road. And when that moment comes, if Kim Jong-un is tempted to resort, as a last resort, to use nuclear weapons to change his fate, then I see no reason why he should, under normal circumstances, I don't think he will be willing to choose a collective suicide. But when he sees that even without using nuclear weapons, he's going to collapse, then he may try a second chance by using nuclear weapons. That's the most dangerous situation, scary situation. And we cannot just be content with deterrence by punishment and defense.
But that's
All the deterrence, the kind of deterrence we need is deterrence by denial. We should be able to deny North Korea's use of nuclear weapons. And that will have to depend primarily on preemption with good ISR. But there's no guarantee that we, as Gary mentioned, there's no guarantee that we can eliminate all North Korean nuclear weapons before they use. That's why we need an effective missile defense system to capture any of those missiles that we miss in preemption. And to the extent that we have a more effective missile defense system, we have to rely less on preemption. So we can have a better, more leeway in defending against North Korean.
Well, let me specifically on that. It's obviously no secret that our Chinese friends have officially expressed grave reservations about the THAAD system. They claim to believe that it's really aimed at depriving China of its deterrent capability. My understanding is we've said a million times, but not been allowed to brief the Chinese decision to not accept the brief, that it's aimed at North Korea, and we will explain that to you if you will let us do it. Has Japan or South Korea been attempting to get China to engage in a rational discussion of missile defense? Or are you still simply hearing about it in terms of it's aimed at us, and you're not able to talk to them about it?
Well, this session
sorry,
is not
yes.
this session is not subject regarding the SAD, but I need to say, number one, the missile defense issue is actually play a role to shift the focus of our common problem, common challenge of the nuclearization by North Korea. A very ironic picture recently is all of our major players, US, China, South Korea, set aside or ignore the North Koreans' more and more provocative efforts towards the more and more dangerous tests, and then we fall into disputes about that. Let's set aside who is right and who is wrong. Just think about one question. Even if US deployed all of the missile defense measures, can South Korean people be in relax, say no matter how many missiles North Korea developed, how advanced missiles North Korea demanded, as long as US has a defense system here, we can go to sleep in relax. The answer, unfortunately, is no. And secondly, in fact, the two sides, I mean between the two Koreas, that's the really sad story for this nation. The two Koreas now following an arms race, and based on the so-called deterrence. North Korea declared they are developing the so-called nuclear deterrence, however, in an offensive posture. They say they will do something. North Korea is the single country in the world say they can conduct the so-called preemptive nuclear war at any time, at any location. And in such a background, no matter how hard you made the efforts for the so-called defensive, no matter it's missile defensive or conventional defensive, it's hard to protect your own real, reliable national security. People here, security is hard. And the key question is, could we have another way for the new game rather than the arms race on the deterrences when South Korea in a defensive posture and North Korea in the offensive posture? That's an advantage for the North and a disadvantage for the South. I think we should return to the right focus on the game between nuclearization and the denuclearization. That is our right choice. So whenever we talk about the denuclearization, in your opening remarks, you are touching a very real long-term dilemma. Earlier this morning, I chatted with Gary. I sadly said, we are in a dilemma. We were in a dilemma. North Korea say, all of your 5 parties want a peaceful solution towards denuclearization. Great. As long as you won't go to military option, then I will try every effort to develop our nuclearization. No way for denuclearization. It's true. Without a military option, all non-military measures cannot stop Kim family's nuclear ambitions. Even the sanctions. Let's suppose, even we have the secondary financial boycott, even we have furthermore like a full trade sanctions. Can Kim family stop their nuclear policy, change to denuclearization? Or can the regime be collapsed under the full trade embargo? The answer, unfortunately, no. So what we can do? When we talk about the dilemma for us, say, no military, peaceful, no way. None of us want a military option, but no way for the peaceful solution to a denuclearization. That's the dilemma facing us for several decades you described. It's true. However, when we talk about the dilemma for us, a bigger dilemma for North Korea is increasing. China's way of thinking about the sanction is, sanction measures could be a creator to create a structure turning the nuclear issue in a matter of opportunity cost. That means with the increasing measures on sanctions, the opportunity cost for North Korea are increasing. And I firmly believe North Korea is in dilemma, much harsher than us. On one hand, they want to nuclearize, no problem, no question about that. But on the other hand, they have a more important strategic goal. That is that's not keep their regime survival. That's want to keep their economy, turn their economy into modernization. They have a lot of modernization plans. And they want open door policy. They want external resources and so on. But the nuclear issue has become a single key obstacle to block every opportunity for North Korea. That is why the dear leader, the old leader, I mean his father said, denuclearization, he repeatedly said. And the young leader never said that, but he smartly replace the Sangam policy with the Bingjin policy, say development of the economy. So what's new in the old North Korea? I would say the new doctrines or new guidelines, say the Bingjin replacing the Sangam policy. That means they have put their economy at the top priority because their economy has been on the unsustainable format. Only when they resume their external relations, then they cannot only keep their survival, also bring about their bright future. So I'm firmly believe, by saying that, I'm firmly believe the young leader's New Year speech earlier, January 1st, was true. That's not propaganda. He focused on economic development, focused on inter-Korean relationship. Unfortunately, days later, they do the negative thing. But they will return after the May conference, parties conference. They will return. That is the true intention. The true intention is really the base for their dilemma. They cannot got both nuclear and the prosperity. No. So I think the sanctions should be smart enough. Sanctions should followed and supported by smart diplomacy in the joint efforts format. So we cannot rely on any single simple measures to solve this complex issue. We should rely on our smart diplomacy based on a necessary sanctions.
So in essence, we're agreeing that we have to really double down, triple down on sanctions, but we also agree that we can't seem to be trying to bring down the regime. It seems to me that there's sort of an inherent contradiction that we're trying to basically threaten him
Wow, okay.
with collapse because he's not cooperating with us. I mean,
Yeah. Actually, there have been a long-term differences between China and South Korea and the
Yes.
U.S. The key difference lies in China pursue for policy change, and you are seeking for the regime change. And in terms of regime change, say the collapse, the regime change has been narrowed down further as a sudden collapse like Soviet or East Germany. The regime change can be varied format, but now a very common concept about the regime is a sudden collapse. Okay, let's say about sudden collapse. Even we put all sanctions, the effects cannot be exceeded more than the situation in mid-1990s, early 1990s, when Soviet suddenly collapsed. That effect to North Korea was much, much bigger than any kind of sanctions. Because at that time, say, North Korea totally rely on external assistances. We didn't have a planning economy, Soviet didn't have. And Soviet bloc, Soviet plus the group of Eastern social countries, contribute a big part of the proportion of the expenses for North Korea, and China contribute the other part. And suddenly, big part of the assistances from the 10 plus nations gone. Such effects didn't lead to the collapse, although at that time, you mentioned earlier, many experts and officials believe in a few years such a regime will be collapsed. That's not the base for our policy thinking.
Right. Those of us who've done this for a long time, the collapse scenario sort of resurfaces about every 5 or 6 years, and almost without fail. And people get all excited about it. They come up with all the 5,000 reasons why, blah, 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 blah. And then somehow it never quite happens again. But I would disagree with you a little bit. Nick Eberstadt and I were discussing this morning. I think to the extent that the atmosphere in Washington is that we need to start talking about regime change in the literal sense is we all agree that the Kim family regime is never going to denuclearize. And if we agree on that, then the regime change debate takes on some real edge. And it isn't just the Colin Powell definition to Iraq. If you change your behavior, you've changed. But there's elements of that. I completely lost track of the time, and I know people have questions. And in fact, I can see Evans Revere right there getting ready to explode because he's got some questions. So Evans, I'm going to call on you. Say, what have I not asked yet, or what have I misstated? What have we not dealt with that you, as a former PDAS and experienced track 2 to this day, what do we need to talk about that we haven't done yet? Or some comments,
We
please.
could go on for days, but
Yeah.
let me ask two quick questions here. This has been a fascinating and important conversation. The first question, let me direct at Gary, if I might. Your very interesting statement about verification, a possible verification of a freeze on the production of fissile material. Since the September 19th agreement fell apart over the issue of verification, how confident are you that the DPRK would ever allow the necessary verification to ensure that such a freeze is actually in effect? And if they were not to allow it, then what is the utility? What is the value of such a freeze? And then my other question, I've been sitting here for 2 days and in corridor conversations talking with my Chinese colleagues, and I have at least 3 different Chinese policies that I have heard on sanctions. My favorite one is the one that we just heard, and that is China is serious about sanctions implementation. I welcome that. That's great news. And that there is a utility of sanctions in raising the cost to North Korea of its continued violation of its international obligations. That's wonderful news. But I have also heard another Chinese colleague say that China is not prepared to apply sanctions on North Korea to the extent that it might risk instability in the DPRK. And then I've heard a third Chinese colleague say that sanctions are not the way to deal with the DPRK, and what we need to do is look at the idea of freezing, exchanging or trading a freeze of North Korea's nuclear weapons production in return for a cessation of US ROK exercises. I always rely on my good friend Xiyu to enlighten me about Chinese policy. Could you please clear up my confusion that's obviously been induced by my advanced jet lag? Thank you.
So let me go first, and then we'll listen to our Chinese colleague. So any, freeze on fissile material production that's meaningful would require North Korea to declare and allow inspection of what we all believe are secret facilities, probably to enrich uranium. North Korea has never been willing to do that up to now, and that's always been the stumbling block which caused the collapse of the 2005 joint statement and led the Leap Day deal to be a very weak agreement because it only covered verification and freeze at Yongbyon. Whether the North Koreans would ever agree to a national freeze on fissile material production, I think depends on 2 factors. One is the extent to which the sanctions are actually having a significant enough effect, so they're looking for some partial sanctions relief. And 2, what the North Korean calculation is about how much nuclear material they need to meet their strategic needs. We don't know how much nuclear material North Korea has. We don't know how many nuclear weapons they have. We don't know how many they think they need. But if they believe they have enough to meet their requirements, and therefore they can accept a national freeze, and they're looking for sanctions relief, then I think it's plausible that Kim Jong-un or whoever the leader is would accept a national freeze. But if they don't, then I think diplomacy doesn't get very far, because I think the Leap Day deal was, a pretty weak agreement for the reason that it didn't cover all the facilities.
But it was intended as a door opener, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a first step.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
a confidence-building measure, which is
Right.
what the diplomats say when they have a weak
Right.
agreement.
But it had an additional real downside to it, and that was that Obama took a hell of a political chance and ended up having it thrown back in his face.
And to me, it was really the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yes.
I mean, Obama had so much skepticism about North Korea and the wisdom and, the utility of diplomacy with North Korea, starting in 2009, when the North Koreans really gratuitously, tore up the agreement they had with Bush and conducted testing. And I think the Leap Day deal really convinced Obama that there was just very little value in engaging diplomacy,
Well,
especially with Kim Jong-un.
Doug Paul, at one of yesterday's seminars, as we're doing our Groundhog Day roundtable here, you rattled off just like that 6 or 7 things that Obama had tried. You know, because I think one of our Chinese friends has said, you Americans haven't done anything, and you correctly pointed out the 6 or 7 things that Obama has tried that didn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's get
Oh,
asked-
sorry, yes.
Xiyu.
Yeah, and as always, all decisive measures or policies from Beijing always trigger first in China rather than out of China, between the so-called international school and the traditional school described by crisis groups a few years ago. Basically, watching or observing China's implementation of resolutions can only focus on the articles and the contents, rather than to think about whether or not such a measure will trigger instability or collapse, simply because nobody can answer what kind of measure can lead to the collapse or instability. So the second school you mentioned is based on an assumption. But when you turn the assumption at the reality, it's hard to tell what kind of measures based on the UNSC resolution can do and cannot do. So basically, Chinese government take a very simple position, say abide by strictly all measures and articles based on the resolution. That is why American friends always complained that it took so long time whenever a resolution came out. Because we have to think about our credibility before we join in and support and vote for the resolution. So now that we have voted for the resolution, just be confident that all measures will be implemented by China strictly. And secondly, I would say all existing UNSC measures has drawn a line, but not cover all of the economic ties between Chinese and the North Koreans. For example, food aid. I would say if North Korea suffer from starvation because of the climate, because of whatever reasons, China will certainly provide humanitarian food aid to North Korea as always. But relating to any non-humanitarian items, China will do not. For example, we used to have a long-time military relationship. We provided a lot of items, but now none of the military things goes to North Korea. No matter it's a stable state or unstable state, that's not a matter between China and the North Korean economic ties. Only when humanitarian, never say about instability. So how about the state situation when Johnson Tech was killed? Was it stable or unstable? Hard to tell. But the hard indicator is, was there starvation or not? China's decision outside of the scope of measures of UNSC based on the necessity of humanitarian consideration and economic stability for the ordinary people there.
Right. I think we're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask Ambassador Chun. This is about Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and your people, primarily. What would you like to leave us with as some final thoughts on what we've heard today? And when we reconvene in a year from now, what are we going to be talking about?
6-party talks, you said?
Here.
Here?
Yes.
I missed your point. Well, I'm afraid that there will not be any fundamental change. And North Korea, it will very much depend on how the combined Security Council and individual sanctions work together in changing North Korea's strategic calculus. But I'm not very optimistic that we'll be dealing with a more favorable situation on the Korean Peninsula. I don't think in the next 1 year there'll be a drastic change in Kim Jong-un's policy. Yang Xiyu mentioned the need for policy change. China's policy is to change North Korea's policy. If we can change North Korea's policy without regime change, it would be great. But I'm not very optimistic about that prospect. And if we cannot change North Korea's policy toward denuclearization, whether we like it or not, the only alternative left is to vote for regime change. It's not an ideal solution, but I think it's just only better than living with nuclear-armed North Korea. And I think we will have to be prepared for a worse situation next year.
Well, that's perhaps an appropriately pessimistic way to end the discussion, but appropriate to the theme of this entire wonderfully interesting and important conference that Chow Hong has very graciously put together for us yet again. We don't know how you do it. The new normal is this continued sense of futility and frustration and anxiety that our friends in North Korea are not going to do what we want, and we can't make them do what we want in any kind of short-term sense, and we can't do things that are going to bring them down that are where the risk is even marginally acceptable. So it sounds like we're back in Groundhog Day again. But in any event, thank you very much for such thoughtful presentations. And I do have to say, I wish all our Chinese friends were as thorough and coherent and consistent as you were, my friend, and thank you for your approach, because I know it often seems like we're ganging up on China, but we all agree that without you, we're not going to make this work, if ever. So thank you so much. And thank you for being very attentive. I'm sorry we talked so much and didn't get to audience questions, but next year.